Hello and welcome to the final part of our winter's tale, The Hunter's Wife by Anthony Doerr. He could have heard anywhere. In the cabin he built up the fire, flipped idly through a stack of her books. He couldn't understand them. One of them wasn't even in English. After dinner she took the plates to the sink. "You read Spanish now?" he asked. Her hands in the sink stilled. "It's Portuguese," she said. "I understand only a little." He turned his fork in his hands. "Were you there when Martin Spokes was killed?" "I helped pull him out of the truck. I don't think I was much good." He looked at the back of her head. He felt like driving his fork through the table. "What tricks did you play? Did you hypnotise people?" Her shoulders tightened. Her voice came out furious. "Why can't you?" she began, but her voice fell off. "It wasn't tricks," she muttered. "I helped carry him." When she started to get phone calls, he hung up on the callers, but they were relentless. A grieving widow, an orphan's lawyer, a reporter from the Great Falls Tribune. A blubbering father drove all the way to the cabin to beg her to come to the funeral parlour, and finally she went. The hunter insisted on driving her. It wasn't right, he declared, for her to go alone. He waited in the truck in the parking lot, engine rattling, radio moaning. "I feel so alive," she said afterward as he helped her into the cab. Her clothes were soaked through with sweat, like my blood is fizzing through my body. At home, she lay awake, far away all night. She got called back, and each time he drove her. He would take her after a whole day of duck hunting and pass out from exhaustion while he waited in the truck. When he woke, she would be beside him, holding his hand, her hair damp, her eyes wild. "You dreamt you were with the wolves and eating salmon," she said. "They were washed up and dying on the shoals." He drove them home over the dark fields. He tried to soften his voice. "What are you doing there? What really?" "I give them solace. I let them say goodbye to their loved ones. I help them know something they'd never otherwise know." "No," he said. I mean, what kind of tricks? How do you do it?" She turned her hands, palms up. "As long as they're touching me, they see what I see. Come in with me next time. Go in there and hold hands. Then you'll know." He said nothing. The stars above the windshield seemed fixed in their places. Families wanted to pay her. Most wouldn't let her leave until they did. She would come out to the truck with $50, $100, once $400 folded into her pocket. She began to go off for weekends, disappearing in the truck before he was up, a fearless driver. She knelt by roadkill, a crumpled porcupine, a shattered deer. She pressed her palm to the truck's grill, where the husks of insects smoked. Seasons came and went. She was gone half the winter. Each of them was alone. They never spoke. On longer drives, she was sometimes tempted to keep the truck pointed away and never return. In the first thaws, he would go out to the river and try to lose himself in the rhythm of casting, in the sound of pebbles driven downstream clacking together. But even fishing had become lonely for him. Everything, it seemed, was out of his hands. His truck, his wife, the course of his own life. As hunting season came on, his mind wandered. He was botching kills, getting upwind of elk, or telling a client to upload and call it quits 30 seconds before a pheasant burst from cover. When a client missed his mark and pegged an antelope in the neck, the hunter berated him for being careless, knelt over its tracks and clutched at the bloody snow. "Do you understand what you've done?" he shouted. "How the arrow shaft will knock against the trees, how the animal will run and run, how the wolves will trot behind it to keep from resting." The client was red-faced, huffing. "Wolves don't hunt here," the client said. "There haven't been wolves here for 20 years. She was in Butt or Missoula when he discovered her money in a boot, $6,000 and change. He cancelled his trips and stewed for 2 days, pacing the porch, sifting through her things, rehearsing his arguments. When she saw him, the sheaf of bills jutting from his shirt pocket, she stopped halfway to the door, her bag over her shoulder, her hair pulled back. "It's not right," he said. She walked past him into the cabin. "I'm helping people. I'm doing what I love. Can't you see how good I feel afterward? You take advantage of them. They're grieving and you take their money." "They want to pay me," she shrieked. "I help them see something they desperately want to see." "It's a grift, a con." She came back out on the porch. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet and strong. "This is real as anything. The valley, the river, your trout hanging in the crawl space. I have a talent, a gift." He snorted. "A gift for hocus pocus, for swindling widows out of their savings." He lobbed the money into the yard. The wind caught the bills and scattered them over the snow. She hit him, once, hard across the mouth. "How dare you?" she cried. "You, of all people, should understand. You, who dreams of wolves every night." In the months that followed, she left the cabin more frequently and for longer durations, visiting homes, accident sites, and funeral parlours all over central Montana. Finally, she pointed the truck south and didn't turn back. They had been married 5 years. 20 years later, in the Bitterroot diner, he looked up at the ceiling-mounted television, and there she was, being interviewed. She lived in Manhattan, had travelled the world, had written 2 books. She was in demand all over the country. "Do you commune with the dead?" the interviewer asked. "No," she said. "I help people. I commune with the living. I give people peace." "Well," the interviewer said, turning to speak to the camera, "I believe it." The hunter bought her books at the bookstore and read them in one night. She'd written poems about the valley, written them to the animals. "You rampant coyote, you glorious buck." She had travelled to Sudan to touch the backbone of a fossilised stegosaur and wrote of her frustration when she divined nothing from it. A TV network flew her to Kamchatka to embrace the huge shaggy neck of a mammoth as it was airlifted from a glacier. She had better luck with that one, describing an entire herd slogging big-footed through a slushy tide, tearing at seagrass and flaring their ears to catch the sun. In a handful of poems that were even vague allusions to him, a brooding, blood-soaked presence that hovered outside the margins, like a storm on its way, like a killer hiding in the basement. The hunter was 58 years old. 20 years was a long time. The valley had diminished slowly but perceptibly. Roads came in and the grizzlies left, seeking higher country. Loggers had thinned nearly every accessible stand of trees. Every spring, runoff from logging roads turned the river chocolate brown, and the soil from the old forests was being washed into the Missouri. In his cabin, bent over the table, he set aside her books, took a pencil and wrote her a letter. A week later, a Federal Express truck drove all the way to the cabin. Inside the envelope was her response, on embossed stationery. The handwriting was hurried and efficient. "I will be in Chicago," it said, "day after tomorrow. Enclosed is a plane ticket. Feel free to come. Thank you for writing." After Sherbet, the Chancellor, called his guests into the reception room, burning candles had been distributed around the room, on the sills, the banister, the mantel, the bookshelves. The bar had been taken down. In its place, 3 caskets had been set on the carpet. A bit of snow that had fallen on the lids, they must have been kept outside, was melting, and drops ran onto the carpet where they left dark circles. Around the caskets, cushions had been placed on the floor. The hunter leaned against the entryway and watched guests drift uncomfortably into the room, some cradling coffee cups, others gulping at gin or vodka in deep tumblers. Eventually, everyone settled on the floor in a circle. The hunter's wife came in then, elegant in her dark suit. She knelt and motioned for O'Brien to sit beside her. His face was pinched and inscrutable. Again, the hunter had the impression that he was not of this world, but of a slightly leaner one. "President O'Brien," his wife said, "I know this is difficult for you. Death can seem so final, like a blade dropped through the neck. But the nature of death is not at all final. It is not some dark cliff off which we leap. I hope to show you it is merely a fog, something we can peer into and out of, something we can know and face and not necessarily fear. By each life taken from our collective lives, we are diminished, but even in death, we have much to celebrate. It is only a transition, like so many others." She moved into the circle and unfastened the lids of the caskets. From where he sat, the hunter could not see inside. His wife's hands fluttered around her waist like birds. "Think," she said. "Think hard about something you would like resolved, some matter gone now, in the grips of the past, which you wish you could take back, perhaps with your daughters, a moment, a lost feeling, a desperate wish." The hunter closed his eyes. "Think now," his wife was saying, "of some wonderful moment, some fine and sunny minute you shared, your wife and daughters, all of you together." Her voice was lulling. Behind his eyelids, the glow of the candles made an even orange wash. He knew her hands were reaching for whatever, whoever, lay in those caskets. Somewhere inside him, he felt her extend across the room. His wife said more about beauty and loss being the same thing, about how they ordered the world, and he felt something happening. A strange warmth, a flitting presence, something dim and unsettling, like a feather brushed across the back of his neck. Hands on both sides of him reached for his hands, fingers locked around his fingers. He wondered if she was hypnotising him, but it didn't matter. He had nothing to fight off or snap out of. She was inside him now. She had reached across and was poking about. Her voice faded, and he felt himself swept up as if rising towards the ceiling. Air washed lightly in and out of his lungs. Warmth pulsed in the hands that held his. In his mind, he saw a sea emerging from fog. The water was broad and flat and glittered like polished metal. He could feel dune grass moving against his shins and wind coming over his shoulders. All around him, bees shuttled over the dunes. Far out, a shorebird was diving for crabs. He knew that a few 100 yards away, 2 girls were building castles in the sand. He could hear their song, soft and lilting. Their mother was with them, reclining under an umbrella, one leg bent, the other straight. She was drinking iced tea, and he could taste it in his mouth, sweet and bitter, with a trace of mint. Each cell in his body seemed to breathe. He became the girls, the diving bird, the shuttling bees. He was the mother of the girls and the father. He could feel himself flowing outward, richly dissolving, paddling into the world like the very first sail into the great blue sea. When he opened his eyes, he saw linen curtains, women in gowns kneeling. Tears were visible on many people's cheeks, O'Brien's and the Chancellor's and Bruce Maple's. His wife's head was bowed. The hunter gently released the hands that held his, stood and walked out into the kitchen, past the sudsy sinks, the stacks of dishes. He let himself out a side door and found himself on the wooden deck that ran the length of the house. A couple of inches of snow already settled on it. He felt drawn toward the pond, the bird bath, the hedges. He walked to the pond and stood at its rim. The snow fell steadily, and the undersides of the clouds glowed with reflected light from the city. Before long, his wife stepped onto the deck and came down to join him. There were things he had been preparing to see, something about a final belief and expression of gratitude for providing a reason to leave the valley, if only for a night. He wanted to tell her that although the wolves were gone, may always have been gone, they still came to him in dreams. That they could run there, fierce and unfettered, was surely enough. She would understand. She had understood long before he did. But he was afraid to speak. He could see that speaking would be like dashing some very fragile bond to pieces, like licking a dandelion gone to seed. The wispy, tenuous sphere of its body would scatter in the wind. So, instead, they stood together. The snow fluttering down from the clouds to melt into the water, where their reflected images trembled like 2 people trapped against the glass of a parallel world. And he reached finally to take her hand.